All right, welcome. We're going to jump right in and tackle a huge question today. How do we actually know that something is true? We're going to explore the two major paths researchers take to figure that out, one that uses numbers and another that uses stories. Let's do this.
So, let's start with the big one, the question that's really at the heart of all science. How do we go from just having a hunch about something to establishing a scientific fact? How do we actually produce what we all agree to call truth?
Well, when you boil it all down, research kind of splits into two main flavors. You've got your quantitative approach, which is all about counting things. It asks how many, to understand the big picture, the scale of something. And then you have the qualitative approach, which digs deeper. It asks why and how, to understand the meaning behind it all. To really get our heads around all this, here's the plan. First, we'll look at this idea of numbers versus narratives. Then, we'll dive into the two different ways of seeing reality that are behind these methods. We'll check out the actual tools researchers use, see how these two approaches can actually work together, and then wrap up with why these human stories are so incredibly important. Okay, first up, this core tension between numbers and stories. A quantitative survey can tell you that 70% of people are happy with a service, and that's super useful for understanding the scale of the issue. But it's the qualitative approach, talking to that other 30%, that tells you why they're unhappy. So you see, it's not about which one is better, it's about what kind of question you're trying to answer. And this is absolutely crucial. No matter which path you take, this isn't just about random guessing. Whether you're crunching numbers from a huge database or just talking to one person for hours, real research is always a systematic process. It has rules, it has rigor, and that's what gives us confidence in what it finds. But here's where it gets really interesting. These different methods, they aren't just about picking different tools from a toolbox. They actually come from two totally different philosophies, two fundamentally different ways of seeing reality itself.
So on one side, you've got positivism. This way of thinking really took off during the Enlightenment, and it's the engine behind most quantitative research. The core idea? That there is one single objective reality out there that we can all see and measure. The goal is to find universal laws that are true for everybody everywhere. This is the philosophy that lets us build bridges that don't fall down and develop life-saving drugs.
And on the other side, we have interpretivism. This philosophy says, hold on, this social world isn't like the natural world. It argues that our reality is way more complex because it's shaped by our own personal experiences and interpretations. So the goal here isn't to find one universal truth, but to understand the many, many different meanings that people attach to their own lives.
And this quote just nails it, right? It perfectly captures what the interpretivist mission is all about. The point isn't just to explain what someone is doing from the outside, as if they were a science experiment. The goal is to truly understand it from the inside, from the perspective of the person who's actually living it.
So how does this play out in practice? Well, positivism usually uses what we call deductive reasoning. Think of it as a top-down approach. You start with a big theory, like fast service makes customers happier. Then you create a specific, testable hypothesis from that, and you go out and collect a bunch of data to see if your theory holds up or not. Qualitative research, on the other hand, does the exact opposite. It uses inductive reasoning, which is a bottom-up approach. You start with specific, real-world observations. You go talk to a few unhappy customers. You listen, and you start to notice patterns. Maybe they all mention that the music in the cafe is way too loud. And from those very specific observations, you build a brand new theory from the ground up. Now, the qualitative toolkit is pretty familiar, right? It's things like surveys, experiments, and all that statistical analysis, all designed to measure things at a big scale. So, if the goal is to listen to stories and really understand meaning, what does the qualitative toolkit actually look like? Well, here are some of the heavy hitters. You've got your in-depth, one-on-one interviews, which are amazing for getting really rich, detailed stories. Then there are focus groups, which are great because you can see how people's ideas bounce off each other. And then there's something called ethnography, where a researcher literally becomes part of a community to see what life is actually like on the inside.
But the world is a messy, complex place, so very often, the most powerful research doesn't just pick one side. It actually moves beyond this simple divide and finds clever ways to mix the methods to get a much more complete picture. And that brings us to this third paradigm, critical research. This approach basically takes the individual stories we get from qualitative work and connects them to the bigger picture. The social, political, and historical forces that are shaping our lives. And what's really important here is that the goal is often to spark real, positive change.
Okay, let's use an example to make this super clear. Let's say we're studying dengue fever. A positivist, quantitative researcher might ask, how effective are our prevention campaigns? And measure that across thousands of people. An interpretivist, qualitative researcher would ask, what is it actually like to live with this disease? And a critical researcher? They'd ask something like, how do things like poverty prevent an entire community from protecting itself? You see, same problem, three vital but totally different questions. And this really brings us to the final and maybe the most important point. Why does any of this matter? Why do we need to bother collecting all these human stories when we have the big numbers? Well, the answer comes down to one word: context.
This chart really lays it all out. But look at that third point. In quantitative research, an outlier, some weird result that doesn't fit, is usually a problem, something you might even throw out. But in qualitative research, that same outlier, that one strange story, that could be the entire discovery. It could be the key that unlocks a whole new way of seeing things.
So, at the end of the day, qualitative methods add a dimension that is just crucial. They help us reach the parts that other methods can't. They're not here to replace the numbers. They're here to fill in the gaps, to add the color and the meaning, and to explain the real human story that's happening behind the statistics.
And this is just so incredibly important in a field like public health. Think about it. A health campaign isn't just about numbers and infection rates. It's about culture, it's about trust, it's about human behavior. Qualitative research is what can explain why a perfectly good intervention is failing in one community, because it actually gives a voice to the very people we're trying to help.
So let's end with this thought. Numbers give us the map of the landscape, an absolutely essential, powerful tool. But it's the narratives, the stories, that give us the feeling of the ground underneath our feet. We really need both to find our way. But it's always worth asking ourselves, when we only stare at the map, what crucial stories from the ground do we risk missing completely?